Welcome to our series on heresies. This is the third episode on Gnosticism. I'm Dr. Christopher Mooney, and I'm joined by Dr. Jim Prothro, both of the Augustine Institute. And we want to look at the heresy of Gnosticism, keeping in mind that the goal of looking at heresies is in order to understand better what the truth is. Now, Gnosticism, that's a kind of, it's a really broad title. It sounds like this intriguing word, but you could think of some of the questions that come up with Gnosticism. Is creation actually good? All these things here, are they actually any good? How about more close to home? Is my body good? Who am I even in relation to my body? These are some of the fundamental questions that come up in Gnosticism.
Yeah, and they can also crop up in other kinds of ways when we talk about like the goal of Christianity.
Yeah.
I have this sometimes in even kids' Bibles, and they don't use the word escape, but they say that, right, the goal of Jesus coming is so that we can leave this earth.
Yeah.
Right? Basically, the goal of Jesus coming is so that we can die, because it would be better to just get out of here, right? And never to be resurrected, right? What's the goal of Christianity? What did Jesus come to free us from?
Yeah.
Did he come to free us from sin, which of course happens in our bodies too,
Yeah.
or did he come to free us from stuff,
Yeah.
right? And being made of stuff,
Yeah.
and being in a world of stuff,
Yeah.
and having stomachs?
Gnosticism has a lot of overlap with Marcionism, which we just did, but I think it actually covers some things specifically. It's really helpful to see. But first, we have to acknowledge it's a really huge umbrella category. In fact, it's really hard to even talk about Gnosticism as one thing. There are tons of different Gnostic movements. Some people don't even like using the term Gnosticism. It covers movements that are outside of Christianity. It covers movements that preceded Christianity. There's sort of Gnostic strands even before Christianity. I think fundamentally that's because Gnosticism is a kind of idea that piggybacks on other religions. It's parasitic on them. And the reason is because it takes the story, in this case of Christianity, it takes the fundamental story and kind of twists it a little bit. It gives it a conspiratorial twist. And that's the thing that's always so interesting about Gnosticism. But what Gnosticism says is it says that it tells a story about how evil powers, not the true God, but actually a variety of other gods who are some combination of evil and incompetent. These evil powers, they created the world. And they trapped sparks of God in the world. And some people have those sparks in them, these kind of divine sparks. And that makes them spiritual people, a kind of person that, and even though that spiritual power has been trapped in them, it hasn't been totally eradicated or destroyed. And what the story of the Bible tells from a Gnostic perspective is the perspective of those evil powers. So actually for Gnosticism, the scripture is misleading. It's fake news, we might say. If Marcionism says, well, the Old Testament is true, it's just bad, Gnosticism says it's all mixed up and jumbled, a misleading story. And it's written by the evil powers until you get to Jesus. Jesus is the one emissary of the true God. He comes to let people know, he comes to speak to the spiritual, to let them know who they truly are. And even though their bodies have trapped them in this material world, when they hear that news that they're really from God, that's liberating. And that's a kind of freeing realization that allows someone to say, this world is not my home. This body is not me. I'm trapped here. But that knowledge, that realization, gnosis, that's where we get the term Gnosticism from, that realization is itself freeing. And so salvation is knowing that.
So help me out here. So you've said realization a whole lot of times, and it makes me, because on the one hand, when I think about spiritual divine sparks in people, right? I think to myself, on the one hand of that's weird. And the other part of me is well, that sounds kind of like the image of God sort of thing, right? That we have the image of God, that we're capable of having relationship with God and knowing God. But it seems like a way in which we can see a difference here already from Orthodox Christianity is that in Orthodox Christianity, all humans, not just some, right, are made in the image of God to be capable of this saving relationship with God. But it's that, it's like the old song from like the 90s or whatever it was. So sorry, anybody who's younger than that. But that there's like we talk about a God-shaped hole in our hearts.
Yeah.
But that it needs to be filled by God, by the Holy Spirit. Whereas in Gnosticism, you sort of already have God in you, and the new job is for you to sort of self-realize, right?
Exactly.
You need to get the knowledge so that you can go, oh, I'm really a spirit being, and I'm a really like don't belong here, and my home is out in this sort of like unworldly, uncreated regions where the sort of creator God isn't around because he was a bummer, and this sort of spirit's way out there in the fullness of things have sent Jesus to come and help me know that this isn't really where I belong, and I can sort of like zip out of here.
Exactly. Yes, and that self-realization is what's saving, or at least it's the beginning of salvation. And it also in Gnosticism changes how you look out on the world, because then you look out on the world and you say, this is really one giant conspiracy.
It's like the Matrix.
Exactly. This is one giant conspiracy where evil gods or evil powers or evil ideologies have trapped me where I am. But at least by knowing, I can have that kind of freedom. And nobody else, or maybe very few other people, have this realization. Particularly, the Bible doesn't have this realization, or at least the Old Testament. And that's where, as I mentioned, Gnosticism takes the story and kind of gives it a little twist, a twist that's very hard to work out. But this twist that's in keeping with this idea that it's all a trap. So, for example, in some Gnostic stories, in the Garden of Eden in Genesis, the Creator is the evil one who has trapped Adam and Eve in their bodies, and the good one is the serpent, who comes to tell them that if they eat, they'll actually have knowledge, and then they can be free. Or in some Gnostic myths, there's actually a secret fourth child that Adam and Eve had. And that fourth child is the parent of all the Gnostics. So you see how in Gnosticism, you have some of the elements of the story, but you add little bits here or there that end up totally changing it.
It's interesting to think about those stories along with, so if some of those about Genesis could be tenets of Jewish Gnosticism when it piggybacked on Judaism, to think about when it piggybacked on Christianity as well. And some of you may have heard of the Gnostic Gospels. Briefly, these are almost all of them written in Egyptian. They usually come from Egypt, and they're a couple hundred years after Jesus at the very, very first time that they're ever written. These are things that were known by the early church, and they said, we don't read that. That's crazy. It's not like they were secretly hidden. But something that is interesting in relation to what you were saying about these is their difference from the canonical Gospels, and I can name maybe three. So one of them is Jesus is always taking people aside to give them secret knowledge that he doesn't give the rest of the apostles. It's funny the way that these heresies sort of build on each other logically. We talked last time about Marcionism, and Marcion thought only Paul got Jesus right, and everybody else misunderstood it. And Irenaeus said, we know lots of people who knew Paul, and none of them taught this crazy thing that you're teaching. Well, if that's how Irenaeus responded to Marcionism, then the Gnostics said, oh no, it's because he only told a couple of people secretly, because only a couple people needed the knowledge and had the spark. And so in the Gnostic Gospels, Jesus is frequently taking people off to the side and saying, I have a message for you that's private. Right, so the Gnostic Gospel of Judas, right? He takes Judas off before he's betrayed, and he says, "You have to get me to die so that I can return to the sort of spirit realm and be away from this thing, and you'll have the knowledge, Judas, and all these other people are nuts." And so he's always taking people aside to give them secret knowledge. Another one is there's almost no interest in what Jesus does. So like the Gospel of Thomas is another Gnostic work. And it's just a series of sayings. Jesus doesn't do anything. He doesn't heal people, right? He just talks to them about how they can realize who they really are. And then so he takes people aside for those kinds of things. He just talks. He doesn't do things, right? Who cares about him dying unless we can interpret it as his sort of escape, right? And showing us the way to escape. But the third thing is, right, he intentionally makes fun of all of the stuff related to the Old Testament Judaism and early Christianity. So when in the Gospel of Judas, when the apostles pray, Jesus laughs at them, right? Because they are so stupid to pray to the God who made stuff. Oh, Creator God, we thank you for this food. And he's like, ha, ha, ha. The true Spirit didn't make food. Food is what you suckers have who are sitting here in your bodies, right? Yes. I can't wait to get out of here. Yeah. Right? And that's the sort of Jesus they present because of this kind of teaching.
There's a very elitist strain to Gnosticism because once you have this knowledge, it separates you from, and it distinguishes you from everyone else. But also in Gnosticism, that knowledge, it's a realization of who you are. It's not just something you know that other people don't know. It's something you are that other people can't be. They're not spiritual people. They're not actually divine beings like I am. And so this radically separates you from others. And it also injects this kind of fatalism in Gnosticism because the people who aren't spiritual, they can't help what they do. And the people who are spiritual, they come inevitably to their knowledge. And this is one of the things the early church really resisted is this kind of, this fatalism in Gnosticism that, if I'm a spiritual being, I'll have that realization. And if I'm not, I never will. Or better, if other people are spiritual beings, they'll come to believe what I think. If they never come to believe what I think, it's because they weren't spiritual beings in the first place.
So it's fundamentally and by definition anti-missional, right? There's no real mission in Gnosticism because most of these people don't even have a chance of, most of these people aren't spiritual. Yes. So why would I even tell them things? Yeah. I'll just let them sit in their deception.
Yes. Yeah. It is like the Matrix, as you said, they're all sort of simulations in the program. They're not real people. But it cuts you off from others very fundamentally. I also thought, you mentioned the example that in the Gnostic Gospels, they never seem to care about what Jesus does. They care about what he says. But this actually fits a lot with the idea that creation and the body is bad. If creation and the body are bad, who cares what Jesus does in his body? Who cares about, his passion and the blood that was spilt on the cross and the sacrifice that he offered? These are all embodied things. They don't really matter. And so Gnosticism both has this contempt for your own body, but it also, and sometimes that can manifest itself in Gnosticism as a really rigorous asceticism. So one sign of Gnosticism can be a kind of punishing relationship to your body, a kind of hatred of your body. But it can also lead to a total indifference towards the body. If salvation is about what I know, then it doesn't really matter what I do in the body. And so I could live however I like. I could do whatever I like with my body. It doesn't make a difference, how I behave towards others or how I use my own body, because this isn't what being spiritual is really about. Being spiritual is on the inside. Stuff I do in the body is something else.
Yeah, so the Gnostic, like you said, Gnosticism is really an idea more than a religion, and it piggybacks on other religions and stories. It seems like the Gnostic idea then, like you could, when it comes out into ethics, it sits in this tension between either creation and bodies are bad, and so I should hate it, and I should try to separate myself from even my bodily needs like food or bodily pleasures. But then another strand that is really sort of knowledge versus holiness, where as long as I know the right stuff, who cares what I do, and I can sort of know the truth and then do the complete opposite because I'm just doing it in my body. My mind is somewhere else.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think one of the most pervasive forms of Gnosticism today is thinking of, and I want to say this again, in a careful way, it's kind of one of the elements. It doesn't make someone a Gnostic heretic, but it's one of those kind of signs of Gnosticism, is thinking of myself as, I'm just spiritual. I don't have to belong to the church in any way, because religion isn't something you do in your body, and it's not something corporate that you do together with other people. It's just about who I am alone. And this can lead to the kind of spiritual but not religious phenomenon, this separation between first of all, the separation in me between me being spiritual and what I do in my body, and the separation from others, because I'm a spiritual person.
Yeah. I can, and with the elitist thing, right? I can go and be spiritual here in this Catholic church, and isn't the art beautiful? But who really cares? But I mean, isn't it beautiful?
Yeah.
But all of you stupid people who stay in the Catholic Church, right? You guys just don't have knowledge. So I'll just sort of leave, and I can also go over here, and I can go to this totally non-Christian group, and each one of these things I can have the exact same sort of spiritiness, because I'm not actually attached to you, and I'm not actually attached to any of the things that we're doing or believing other than in ourselves.
Yeah. You know, one place where Gnosticism comes up a lot today that I think is really interesting is actually in the writing of Pope Francis. So some of you might know Pope Francis.
Maybe clarify. It shows up in his writings.
He's
accidentally doing it, or he's mentioning it.
He mentions it. He warns us against Gnosticism.
Okay.
But I want to explain why, because the Pope Francis makes a great point. Yeah, no, not Pope Francis, the Gnostic. He makes a warning against Gnosticism. Because Pope Francis, he has this great exhortation called Gaudete et Exsultate. It's all about the universal call to holiness. And he names these two hindrances. He thinks happen today that keep us back from holiness. One of them is thinking that salvation is all about what you will, and he links this to Pelagianism, which we'll come back to later. But the other is thinking that salvation consists in what I know. And this he identifies as Gnosticism. So Pope Francis warns us against this idea of thinking salvation consists in knowledge. And like the other things we've been mentioning, it has this kind of savor of Gnosticism. And the reason is because there's this idea that creeps up for Christians sometimes that I've got to get all of the particular nitty-gritty, points of doctrine right. I've got to be on the right side of every controversial issue in the church. And people who are on the wrong side, they don't have the saving knowledge. I've got to be on the right side.
And sometimes people think they're not even worth saving. Right?
Exactly, yeah. Or, you can see this in a secular way in the kind of idea of the right side of history. This too has a kind of Gnostic tinge to it. I've got to be on the right side of knowledge. And now, like all heresies, it has some element of truth to it. God does care about knowledge. That's the whole reason we're talking about heresies. It's important to us. But to think that my salvation consists in knowledge, that it's enough, or that I have to be driven by an obsession towards knowledge, I think this is actually something that Pope Francis is warning us about. And one of the reasons he warns us about it is because, as with Gnosticism in the early church, it creates these elite circles within the church. There are, it inclines people to think, well, I'm among the people who know. I've taken the right stand, not on a matter essential to the faith, but on some other issue. I've taken the right stand, and that makes me in the know. And other people, they're not in the know. And so it separates, it sort of drives a wedge in the church. It cuts you off from everyone else. And it's actually can be kind of comforting of thinking, I can be a sort of lone ranger, just saved by my right knowledge, and I don't have to have anything to do with everybody else in the church.
Or even when you mentioned some of the sort of controversial issues, right? When one is tempted to say, well, I took a stand, or I voted the right way, and then I actually did the thing that I condemn other people for thinking is okay. But it's okay for me to do it, or maybe it's just a minor thing because I took the right stand at least. So this is fine, and don't bother me about it.
Yes.
Who's a good saint to help us think about a sort of model of opposing Gnosticism? Last time you talked about Irenaeus opposing Marcionism.
Yeah.
What about this one?
And Irenaeus was an opponent of both Marcionism and Gnosticism. So there's so many, there's so many examples that we could think of. Gnosticism and Marcionism, like the heresies we want to look at in this series, they crop up again and again. So you have lots of saints throughout the whole history who are great opponents of Gnosticism. I mean, you could think of St. Francis and his care for creation, his understanding of the great dignity of creation. But an example that I think might be helpful for people to think of isn't one particular saint, or at least one particular saint from the early church, but is the whole company of martyrs from the early church. You could think of martyrs from the 2nd century, like Ignatius of Antioch or Justin Martyr, or the skeleton martyrs, all of these different martyrs that we know about from the early church, they actually were some of the best witnesses against Gnosticism. And it's because they thought, their act of martyrdom proves that they thought that being a Christian isn't just a matter of what you know or what you say or what you think. It has to be manifest in your body, in how you live. The martyrs were willing to say they were Christians and to do it. They were willing to die for their faith. You know, you could see the Gnostic tendency. It could lead you to say, well, I'm a spiritual being. I'll offer the pinch of incense to Caesar. It doesn't matter. I can remain faithful on the inside where I really am. It doesn't matter what I do in the body. And the martyrs are great witnesses of that because they lived a consistent life in their faith and in their bodies. And to add just one more point, you know, I think they did this in imitation of Christ. And Christ also, you know, truly dying in the flesh. This is something the Gnostics always really hesitated about. They often denied that Christ really died in the flesh or that he was really embodied. And so when the martyrs die in their flesh in imitation of Christ, you know, they actually suffer in their bodies. It's a great witness to the truth.
No, that's really powerful. Not to just think about like a specific person who taught well against Gnosticism, but because of the way that this idea takes hold and piggybacks in so many ways, people whose lives and deaths were witnesses against it. And I'd also add hope too, right? So many of the martyrs start off their confessions by saying, right, I believe in the God who created the world, just like the martyrs in 2 Maccabees chapter 7, right? I believe in the God who created the world, and I'm going to give up my life for him, not because I despise the earth or my body that God created, or because I think a bad God made it, right? But because I know that he will care for my soul when it's separated from my body, and I know that he will raise me from the dead. Right? And so there, right, there's always that grain of truth, right? There, one can think about dying as a sort of being freed from particular suffering in the body that we're going through or something like that. But it doesn't make the body bad. It makes the suffering and the world that's broken by sin bad. And God says that he will, right, restore it by raising us and renewing the heavens and the earth. And confession against Gnosticism is both in the first article of the Creed, right? I believe in God Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, but also at the end of the second one where we say, I look forward to the resurrection of the dead, right? That I think that that's good news instead of a bummer that I'll actually have a body again, perfected and apart from suffering.
If you want to fight Gnosticism in yourself, think about the resurrection. The resurrection is this real hope that the same God who made will also restore the world. So thank you, everyone, for joining us as we think about Gnosticism. We want to see again how, in understanding Gnosticism better, we have a greater appreciation for the fullness of the truth. God bless.